So we're here with Patrick Rothfuss, who's graciously agreed to have a little time with us to ask some questions.
They made me cookies.
We made cookies, that's right. And he's drinking some warm water, so he'll have that deep, rich baritone. So I'm going to hit you with some questions. Some of these are things that are just, they're actually dear topics to me, and I have a lot of personal interest in them. I had a conversation once with David Morrell, and he has this position that I think is rather insightful around the degree to which there's some autobiography in fiction. Not that it's deliberate, like I sit down to write my life fictionally, but that usually in retrospect, his observation is that he finds some of this. I wonder if you looked back at any of your fiction and found any of that to be true. No?
You know, everybody always assumes, and it's a fair assumption, you know, they're like, oh, you know, Rothfuss went to college for 11 years, and then he wrote a story about a guy who went to college, you know, but no, it's a fair assumption, because I know a lot of people do that.
Yeah.
But those stories have always, with rare exception, it's sort of like, they kind of course you pull from your life, because what else can you pull from? You
Right.
pull from your experience and what you read and what you know and what you've learned. But there's a difference between, you know, it's like, here's my freshman year in college, and I'm going to put it in a fantasy setting, I'm going to slap a cheap coat of paint on it, and there it's a book, you know?
Right.
That's very crude, in my opinion, and it's fairly easy to spot, as opposed to my girlfriend eats apples, like, you know, all the way around till you have an apple core, and then she eats the apple core. And I'm like, that's a neat thing. And so I took that there. That is something I will take, and then I put that into the book.
So, yeah.
And I take a lot of those things, and then I make up a lot of things, and then I use that to make a book. And so, you know, that's about as small as you can get, like how you eat an apple. Mm-hmm. You know, that's not even world building. That's not even character development. It's just, it's a, you know. But so, you know, inevitably you have to put some of your own experiences into a book. But the assumption is always that the author is writing about themselves.
Just very thinly veiled.
Yeah, it's like, oh, here now I have some sort of political view to pontificate about, or oh, now I, you know, here's how I feel about love, or here's how I feel about whatever. People always come up to me and say, well, they don't come up to me, they email me and they say, you know, maybe you could lay off the poets a little bit. You know, we poets kind of, you know, are writers too. And I'm like, what? And they're like, you're really down on poetry. I'm like, I write poetry. I've written poetry for years. I'm a badass poet. When I turn my hand to it, that's both. You know, like he's in the book. I wrote the book.
Yeah.
You know, we're different.
Yeah.
But again, it's an understandable thing. I mean, it's an understandable thing, but in my case, it just is not particularly true.
Yeah. Let's talk about epic as a subgenre in fantasy. I find it really interesting the kinds of definitions that get bandied about, whether it's a publisher or a fan, you know, a reader or a writer. I had a conversation once that was really stimulating for me in a discussion around the degree to which a single life is epic, separate from the stakes involved, whether that person's in peril or they're trying to save the world, these kinds of things. And in reading your work, I get the sense that epicness for you isn't the definition that I think the industry marketers use. And even though your books are voluminous, they're not epic simply because they're voluminous.
Well, I think you're right. It's not a well-defined term in any way. And usually people use it like art. You know, it's like, well, I can't tell you what it is, but I know it when I see it. Yeah. It's like, that's epic, that's not epic. Why? Well, I just know. And for some people, it means high stakes. You know, if there's an army, it's epic. You know, if there's multiple books, it's epic. If they're fat books, it's epic. Some people mean if it's dramatic, then it's epic. Some people mean if it's high fantasy, then it's epic.
Yeah.
You know, if it's high fantasy in multiple volumes, then it's epic. if nobody goes to the bathroom or catches VD, it's epic.
I like that one best.
Yeah, but really, I think most people just assume that epic is big, which I don't think is a fair definition. I don't know if what I write is epic. I don't bother thinking about it very much. I think it's probably, I could say that this is heroic fantasy, but that's not a genre that gets, people don't talk about heroic fantasy as a genre, because the assumption is that you always have some manner of hero.
Yeah. Okay. Here's another one. And I apologize if some of these you get before. So feel free to use some shorthand on some of these.
I'll pass if one of them
I've done this. Refer to. So, this happens a lot at conventions, and I'm guilty of having this conversation and getting passionate about it. But I'm thinking about fantasy as a particularly well-suited genre to explore more classical definitions of good and evil. I was in a panel at Worldcon, not me personally. I was watching a panel at Worldcon once, and there was a whole line of authors there, and I won't use names because there were some names we don't recognize. And they were talking about evil, and there was one gentleman who was a scientist at one end, and he said, "Look, there's no such thing as evil." He said, "Evil is, the bad things people do to each other. I open a paper and I see evil." And there was a writer who I adore at the other end who, it got quiet. Like it was a moment. And he went like this, he looked down and he said, "When you feel evil, you fucking know it." And everybody kind of like, yeah, you kind of do. So, so I get in these topics. And I'm wondering, maybe as a springboard, not to ask you about good and evil, but do you think that there are things that this particular genre does well, sort of, or, inherently versus other genres?
I think that fantasy has a great deal of potential that other genres don't have. Fantasy, one of its great strengths is it plays the what-if game better than any other fiction. Yeah. Fiction is the game of what if. If you're writing history, or I think of it as faction. You're either writing faction or fiction.
I like that term.
And faction is stuff that really happened. That is answering the question, what is? And fiction is asking the question, what if? And they're both interesting questions, but for me this one is more interesting.
Yeah.
And in terms of exploring ethical issues, philosophical issues, religious issues, societal issues, fantasy tends to get used for that a lot, sometimes to the detriment of the story being told.
Yeah.
But I can understand why, because you're able to, in a fantasy story, you're able to look at the problem one removed. Because with really important things, if you discuss them in the real world, people tend to be very emotional about the things, and that means that they're irrational. Emotion is of its nature an irrational thing. And so you bring up politics, and the conversation is over, except for a few very rare people who actually want to talk instead of just...
People kind of divide into camps pretty quickly.
Pretty quickly. Or religion, or sex, or, any number of things. But if you're able to say, okay, let's not talk about the Democrats and Republicans. Let's talk about a different society. Let's create a hypothetical. And not just a flimsy straw man hypothetical like you use to win some sort of shit pub argument, You create a real hypothetical where here's another world with a different society, or here's a person dealing with a problem. Now, suddenly this isn't you dealing with your problem, because as soon as you do this to somebody, it's very, that's not a comfortable thing. But if you say, look at this person, look at what they're going through, that's the classic Chesterton line. The important thing about fairy tales isn't that it tells us there are dragons, it's that it tells us that dragons can be beaten. And not that all fantasy is allegorical or metaphorical, but it gives us kind of a safe space in which we can discuss big things. Now the good-evil issue, I'm not. I guarantee that nobody ever says good or evil in here, because that has always struck me as kind of a convention of the genre.
Yeah.
Which probably started back with fantasy as almost sort of a religious allegorical tool, and Tolkien kind of took it there too, where you very obviously you have Mordor and Sauron and all these people, although he didn't use it very much either. For him, you had the wise and then the unwise, and that was the division for him. I'd like to maybe look at a concordance of that and see how often Tolkien actually used the word evil.
Yeah. That's an interesting question.
But for me, I have to side with that scientist for the most part. Evil is a fraught term. Selfishness, that is something that you can say, this person is being selfish,
right,
or this person is being rude. And actually, it's much better to look at something like that. Evil is very sticky and messy, but being rude to someone is stealing from them, or hurting them, or killing them. All those things are rude to varying scales, right? And so it's like, well, is it evil? Rude, selfish, self-centered. Those are easier terms. You don't have quite as much of a sticky mess with them.
There's less interpretation too.
Yeah. It ends up being less of a semantic just swamp you have to wade through.
Yeah. That's good. I like that. Okay, I'm going to do some self-editing because I want us. We happen to be at an event here where you're going to sign about 1,500 books soon.
Buttload of books.
So we've got work to do, but I want to hit you a few more questions. I've read and seen interviews where you talk about your world building, so I have a pretty good sense about that, and I think a lot of the fans who will probably watch this video do too. But the thing I may have missed, or that I don't believe I've heard you talk about is, do you do a lot of that really up front so that when you get to the story writing, there's less discovery? Or do you find that even having built your world and the construct, that in the writing itself, there's discovery, and so that the world continues to build even in the process of putting the words on the page?
It's both.
I
do it before, I think about it a lot, and then as I write, I discover.
More
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so 2 novels, but a story that started 14 years ago? Is that right?
At this point, 16 years ago, 17 years ago, back in '94.
So you've been writing for a long time. I'm wondering, in that 16 years, how have you evolved as a writer? What are the things that you think that where you've grown?
Boy, that's almost like saying, so, you went through puberty. What was that like? It's too big a question.
Okay.
It's sort of like, I've been in a relationship with my girlfriend for 14 years, and nobody would ever say, so how has your relationship changed over 14 years? It's so big. Most of what I know now as a writer, I've learned in these last 14 years.
Yeah.
Yes, all.
Yes, all.
I can't answer that one.
No,
it's too big.
No, I think that in some way that's a good answer, right? It might be disappointing to think that as you're evolving your craft that the sea isn't rising all. Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Although I will say this, I've always been pretty good at the putting words together part, like writing a sentence and having it sound good.
Yeah.
That has always been easy for me. What I've learned more about is the actual craft of the writing a novel. Telling a story, pacing, plot, or how to fake plot. Things like that. How to massage a story that's really 3 books long, so that it feels, each book is a discrete entity unto itself, with a rise and a fall and a shape and a beginning and an ending. That's what I've had to learn a lot of these last 10 years.
Okay.